In this lecture, we will take a closer look, at the unique qualities of what it means to be human, and we will attempt to understand this in relation to the developing fossil record. One of the initial questions that many paleoprimatologists and paleoanthropologists pose regarding the development of humankind is the transition that may or may not have existed between what we saw of gracile and robust Australopithecines and members of Homininae. So what of this difference? Well, when we compare Australopithecines, both gracile and robust, to genus Homo, we realize that hominids, in general, in comparison to all fossilized and living forms that we taxonomically incorporate into the Primates order, have a greater cranial capacity. Additionally, we recognize an increase in body mass, fluctuations in growth patterns or growth rates, bipedal locomotion, or a greater tendency toward bipedal stance and locomotion, and a reduction in dental size. Correspondingly, there is a reduction in the lower face. We'll begin our look at this transition from Australopithecine to genus Homo by engaging the idea of energy efficiency. In this case, we want to take a look at how living forms in the late Pliocene and the Pliopleistocene and the Pleistocene are more efficiently extracting energy from the natural environment. A characteristic that has to be considered when we're looking at energy efficiency in the late Pliocene and throughout the Pliopleistocene epoch is the impact that an enlarged body size would have had on daily habits. Another concept to consider is what impact the variations in brain size and brain function would have had in terms of behavior. Lastly, we have to consider what would have differed between Australopithecines and members of genus Homo at this very important turning point in the overall history of the Earth's biosphere. We could take a closer look, and will take a closer look, at patterns of development and growth as it relates to the human model and what we may or may not be able to say about both gracile and robust Australopithecines. When we compare the living human model to other primates within the living Primates order, we recognize that human children have much slower rates of growth and maturation. This is especially the case when we specifically compare living hominids today, in this case members of genus Homo, to living hominoids. When considering all of these consequences in relation to biological or populational evolution, we have to focus in on this concept of reproductive success. Reproductive success, also known as adaptive fitness, is a central issue in our understanding and recollection of the past. For the purposes of this lecture and subsequent lectures on this topic, what I would like you to consider is adaptive fitness in relation to the notion that it is a demographic quality that ensures the proliferation of a species, the ability that a species has to be present in the fossil record, or the fossilizing or mineralizing record, and in the living record today. In order to better understand this relationship between efficiently mining energy from the local environment and one's ability or a population's expression of adaptive fitness, it's important to measure not only what we find in the fossil record, but also the living record in a cost-benefit model. cost-benefit models, as they apply to economic systems, tell us that there is an optimal balance that must exist between the cost of something and the benefits of ownership or possessing something. Evolutionary biologists then apply this concept, this need for a balance or an equilibrium between cost and benefit as it relates to trait expressions within the fossil record and within the anatomy and physiology of forms in the living record. By applying this cost versus benefit kind of model to the biology of the planet, it really equates to the notion, or can be applied strictly to the notion, of reproductive success on a populational level. In our next lecture, we'll be taking a look at some of the fossil forms that are associated with the emergence of the hominines, or the first fossil forms to which the genus distinction of Homo can be applied. For this lecture, however, as we step back and look at what it means to be human, we'll take a look at one particular fully hominine expression within the fossil record, in this case, the fossil form Homo ergaster. Initially discovered in the Turkana geologic basin of modern Kenya, this particular fossil form and the deposits that it's associated with date to between 1.9 and 1.5 million years ago. Ergaster is unique because it gives us a truly human form that is fully fossilized. It is a biped. It has pretty abstract cognition. It is a tool user. And its populational distributions are increasing. We see ergaster populations moving into more treacherous climates. In order to understand the relationship that energy has to the ergaster story, let's take a look at the relationship between weight and height across some of the forms we've already talked about and those forms which are right around the corner. Though you won't have to memorize the breakdown that is associated with this slide, I would like you to take a moment and begin to compare some of the numeric expressions that are listed in relation to the fossil forms that we are currently studying. The first column of numbers represents a numeric ratio between weight and height. This is a composite expression for males and females of each of these forms. Females in each of these populations will be listed first, males second. So, to take a look at the Australopithecus afarensis material, you'll note that females, the ratio between weight and height in this case is expressed as 29.3, whereas males have an expression, a ratio of weight to height, at 44.6. The second column, the larger numbers that you see listed along the right hand portion of the slide, represents energy burden. This is the projected resting metabolic rate for each of the populations listed. This would be kilocalories per hour, or watts expended at rest. Given this brief description, sit back and compare the two columns. Ask yourself, which of these populations are larger, physically larger? Which have a greater difference between males and females? And which express greater risk when it comes to resting metabolic rates? The implication here is that there would have been a greater amount of daily food intake, given the larger sizes of particular forms, especially those associated with genus Homo. And the chemistry of food would also have to have been different to support such a large metabolic structure. Jaws and teeth would have been reduced, and dentition would have been fairly generalized. It would have been designed, in a sense, to adapt to a wider range of food types. Proteins from meat, for example, would have been important, or it would have been of greater importance to members of genus Homo. And of course, we see its importance in relation to humans today. However, when we take a look at humans today, we realize that living populations can only metabolize enough meat to account for 50% of their daily protein and calorie intake potential. Fats, again, drawn from food resources, both animal and plant, would have had to fill in the remaining portion of the diet. Please take a moment to compare the upper dental arcades of these three forms. In this case, you would be comparing a living ape to a fossil form such as Australopithecus afarensis, and then you would also apply it or compare it to a human expression, in this case, a member of Homo sapiens sapiens. After making this comparison, return to the topic of fats in one's diet. What I would like you to note is that fat production and storage would have been very important for the survival of these forms. As climates cooled and food resources in that growing savanna environment became more challenging to acquire, fat storage would have proven important to the survival of not only an individual, but his or her population. Today, health professionals project over 9,000 calories of fat that are part of the human annual diet to help living humans with, in this case, between 4 to 6 days of starvation assistance. This means that the fats that we store are very important to our survival. Then, on a behavioral level, we have to engage this unique form of locomotion that we begin to see indirectly in the anatomy and physiology of Australopithecines and directly in the living hominids today, bipedalism. Unlike early Australopithecines, Homo ergaster, who is the focus of our lecture today looking at the human element, would have had longer legs in relation to his or her body. His cranial and postcranial physiology would have reflected the typical body type of a habitual biped. We will return to these cranial and postcranial anatomical traits in our next lecture, but let's take a moment to look at this cost-benefit model in relation to bipedal locomotion. Though longer legs meant fewer steps, there is a considerable amount of energy expenditure that we have to relate to this new form of locomotion, especially in relation to increased body mass indices and the increased weight of the hind limbs or legs. Additionally, as climates continued to cool, more walking was important to daily food gathering and potentially hunting. This means that more walking relates to greater energy expenditure. By closely examining the populations associated with Homo ergaster, paleoprimatologists and paleoanthropologists recognized that there was an increase of nearly 85% in terms of the amount of blood oxygen and energy that was required to be a member of this population and survive in this ever-cooling climatological landscape. An increased need in energy would have resulted in not only enlarged body sizes and metabolisms associated with these, but the longevity of populations would also have increased. When we take a look at primates that incorporate bipedalism into their daily behavior or their overall behavioral ecology, we recognize, in this case, energy expenditure to jump between 9 and 12% in relation to all living mammals. When fossil hunters take a look at and analyze the anatomy and physiology of these early members of genus Homo, they recognize a downturn in population sizes. They recognize that fewer children were being had and that population sizes themselves and their density were decreasing. Over time, however, as humans or members of genus Homo were able to cover a larger geographical space and gather more foods. This would be associated with the term catchment. Catchment in this case is the physical space required to meet one's daily subsistence or energy needs. What they find is that there would have been an eventual increase in the number of offspring, and population sizes would have increasingly crept higher and higher as males and females, through bipedal locomotive patterns, could have provided greater food resources, even in times of drought or environmental stress. Let me quickly review some of the consequences then that are associated with bipedalism. And let me also tie them into the change in body form and body size that we reviewed earlier. Bipedalism, even though it was initially a very risky form of locomotion, would have resulted in increased populational sizes because of larger catchment space and more intra-group competition. Secondly, there would have been an increase in body mass and brain capacity as a result of some of the anatomical changes that we would assign to a habitual biped. Lastly, we would associate bipedalism with greater reproductive success or greater reproductive fitness on a populational level. Bipedalism in this case was advantageous in the expanding and cooling savanna grasslands of what is today the savanna of Africa.